In a small, quiet town in Kentucky, there lies a chilling story that has been buried under layers of secrecy for decades. This is a tale not of folklore or myth, but of a real, horrifying legacy. In 1947, a county health inspector, Robert Mills, was sent to investigate a report of child neglect in a remote cabin. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life, and it's a story that to this day sends shivers down the spines of those who know it. What he found inside that cabin was not just a family struggling with poverty. It was a nightmare that defied every moral and biological law known to humankind. The Hadley family, as they were known, had lived in isolation for generations. But this wasn't an isolated case of poor living conditions. What Robert Mills uncovered was much darker than that. The family in that cabin wasn't just living off the beaten path, they were trapped within a vicious cycle of inbreeding that had led them down a path of unimaginable suffering. In 1923, Martha Whitlock married Thomas Hadley. On the surface, this seemed like a normal Appalachian marriage between two young people in the coal mining region of Kentucky. But underneath there was a secret that would shape the next few decades of their lives and the lives of those who followed them. Martha had a younger sister, Sarah, who was deeply dependent on her. The sisters had grown up in extreme isolation, having lost their parents in a tragic mining accident. As Martha prepared to marry Thomas, Sarah became frantic, unable to bear the thought of being left behind. Her emotional attachment to her sister was so intense that she threatened to take her own life if Martha went through with the marriage. This is where the story takes a disturbing turn. Martha, in an attempt to calm Sarah's fears and keep her close, made a decision that would seal their fate. She promised Sarah that Thomas would be their shared husband. This decision wasn't just emotional support, it was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. Soon both sisters were pregnant, Martha and Sarah within months of each other, both carrying Thomas's child. The family moved into a secluded cabin, 15 miles away from the nearest town, and began living as a polygamous unit. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't have possibly known, was the genetic disaster they were setting in motion. Thomas Hadley wasn't just Martha's husband, he was also their distant cousin, which meant the children born from these unions weren't merely half-siblings, but were the result of multiple generations of genetic overlap. As the years passed, the Hadley family's children began to exhibit signs of severe genetic disorders. By 1930 they had produced 8 children, and yet the family continued to live in their isolated cabin, unaware of the growing consequences of their actions. The children began to suffer from developmental issues, severe seizures, stunted growth, and other physical deformities. Local doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. The family continued to grow, with the birth of more children, and each one seemed to suffer from increasingly severe disabilities. James, the eldest son, was the first to show signs of a serious condition. At 12 years old, his spine began to curve unnaturally, and he suffered from severe seizures that no one could explain. He was the size of a 10-year-old child, though he was already 16. His condition worsened, and it was clear that his body was not developing in the way it should. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with a range of genetic disorders that had resulted from the inbreeding. But the family, in their ignorance, didn't understand that the source of their problems lay within their own bloodline. Meanwhile, James's half-sister Mary, born just months after him, had an even more tragic fate. Her facial structure was severely deformed, her eyes set too far apart, and her skull misshapen. She was completely deaf, and her deformities were so severe that the family kept her hidden from the rest of the community. For her entire life, she lived in the family's cabin, away from the prying eyes of neighbors who were too afraid to ask questions. But this was just the beginning. As more children were born, the deformities and genetic defects only became more pronounced. Birth defects, developmental delays, and physical disabilities became the norm for the Hadley children, rather than the exception. By 1935, 6 of the 8 children had suffered from severe genetic damage. 2 had died in infancy from what doctors called failure to thrive, but modern medical experts believe they died from multiple organ failure caused by genetic incompatibility. The family was slowly unraveling, and Thomas Hadley, the patriarch of the family, turned to alcohol to cope with the consequences of his actions. But Martha and Sarah, despite the clear signs of genetic devastation, refused to accept the truth. They believed their children's ailments were caused by outside forces, evil spirits, bad luck, or even divine punishment. They never considered that they themselves were the source of their children's suffering. In 1940, something happened that should have been impossible, yet the Hadley family had long since abandoned the realm of normal human existence. James, the severely disabled eldest son, somehow fathered a child with his half-sister Mary. The pregnancy nearly killed Mary, and the child that was born defied every medical expectation. The baby lived only 3 months, born without fully developed lungs, organs that were out of place, and a brain so damaged it never achieved consciousness. This tragic death didn't stop the family's genetic nightmare, it only accelerated it. Martha and Sarah, now in their 50s, began encouraging their surviving children to continue the cycle of inbreeding. They believed that by keeping the bloodline pure, they could eliminate the family's health problems. But they were wrong. The genetic damage continued to grow, and by 1942, 3 more children were born within the family. These third-generation children had even more severe genetic disorders than their predecessors: club feet, blindness, mental retardation, and skeletal deformities that left them unable to walk or sit upright. By 1943, the situation had reached a new level of medical horror. A child was born who was so severely deformed that the doctors who examined the X-rays refused to believe they were of a living human being. The child's organs, heart, liver, kidneys, were all positioned incorrectly, and yet somehow this child survived for 2 agonizing years before succumbing to multiple organ failure. As the Hadley family's genetic experiment spiraled deeper into tragedy, the medical professionals who interacted with them began to lose their grip on reality. William Patterson, the county coroner, wrote in his private notes that the Hadley family had become a laboratory of human genetic destruction, and he couldn't bear to provide medical care that prolonged their agony any longer. But this nightmare continued. In the winter of 1947, Robert Mills, the county health inspector, arrived at the Hadley family's cabin. His mission was to investigate a report of child neglect, but what he discovered was far beyond anything he could have anticipated. Mills described the scene as one that belonged in a medical horror story. The family, 17 people in total, was living in squalor, with no running water, no electricity, and little heat. But it wasn't the unsanitary conditions that haunted him the most. It was the genetic damage that had accumulated over generations of incest and inbreeding. Mills discovered children who could not walk, could not speak, and in some cases could not even focus their eyes. He documented children who had been born as a result of sibling unions, and he noted that Martha and Sarah were still actively encouraging these relationships as a way of preserving the family bloodline. The most disturbing aspect of Mills' report wasn't the condition of the family's living quarters, it was the psychological state of the family members. The Hadleys had created their own internal logic to explain their suffering. They believed that their genetic problems were signs of divine favor, that they had been chosen by God for some higher purpose, and that outsiders simply couldn't understand their sacred mission. Mills, despite the horrors he had witnessed, continued his report. He spoke to Martha, who now in her 60s and showing signs of severe mental decline, told him that their family's suffering was a test of faith. She claimed that outsiders couldn't understand, that their genetic problems were part of a greater divine plan. But Robert Mills knew better. He knew that this was a family trapped in their own ignorance, their own denial of the truth. The children were suffering, and unless something was done, they would continue to suffer. The Hadley family, now teetering on the edge of collapse, was about to face an intervention. Mills' report triggered a chain of events that would end their genetic experiment, but not before claiming more victims. In March 1947, State Social Services arrived at the Hadley cabin, armed with Mill's documentation, to remove the children from their parents' custody. But what they found was more than they had bargained for. Martha and Sarah, now in their 60s, had barricaded themselves inside the cabin with shotguns, screaming that government agents were trying to destroy God's chosen people. A tense standoff ensued, lasting 3 days. During those 3 days, 2 more children died, not from violence but from the extreme stress that their compromised immune systems couldn't handle. The state officials, unprepared for the level of genetic damage they encountered, had to call in medical specialists from the University of Kentucky to assess which children might be able to survive outside the family environment. The results were grim. Of the 11 surviving children, only 3 were deemed capable of potential rehabilitation. The others, suffering from severe intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and medical conditions that required constant care, were deemed too far gone to live independently. Martha and Sarah, now firmly entrenched in their delusions, were eventually committed to a state mental hospital, where they spent their final years insisting that the problems their family faced were the result of external forces, evil spirits, government conspiracies, and divine punishment, rather than the inbreeding they had orchestrated. Thomas Hadley, the man who had set this entire disaster in motion, had died in 1945 of liver failure. He never lived to see the full extent of the genetic nightmare he had created, but the consequences of his actions lingered far beyond his death. The surviving children were scattered across different counties, given new identities, and relocated to foster care systems, but their lives were forever scarred by the genetic legacy of the Hadley family. Of the 3 children who survived and were deemed capable of rehabilitation, 1, a girl named Rebecca, would live until 1983. She was placed in foster care, received medical treatment, and learned to read and write. However, she never married, never had children, and lived in constant fear that the genetic damage she carried would be passed on to future generations. The fear of repeating the cycle haunted her throughout her life, and she lived in isolation, keeping her past a secret from the world. The medical records from the Hadley family became infamous in the study of genetics, inbreeding, and the effects of genetic isolation. Universities across the country sought copies of the state's files, using them to educate medical students about the dangers of genetic degradation. The genetic legacy of the Hadleys became a cautionary tale, an example of how human ignorance, fear, and desperation can lead to the destruction of an entire bloodline. The research that stemmed from these records contributed to early studies on genetic counseling, helping to establish protocols for identifying at-risk populations in isolated communities. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Hadley family is the question it raises about human nature itself. Martha and Sarah Whitlock weren't evil women. They weren't monsters. They were simply 2 sisters, isolated by circumstances beyond their control, who made decisions out of fear, desperation, and an unrelenting need to hold on to the only family they had left. They believed they were doing what was best for their family, that keeping the bloodline pure would solve their problems, but in reality, they were speeding up the destruction of their family, each decision compounding the suffering they had already inflicted. Today, the cabin where the Hadley family lived has been reclaimed by the Kentucky wilderness. The foundation stones are still visible through the thick undergrowth, a haunting reminder of the lives lived in isolation. Locals occasionally report finding old bottles and rusted farming equipment in the surrounding woods, but no one dares to build there, no one camps there. No one speaks of what happened on that isolated hillside, where 2 sisters made a pact that would condemn generations of children to lives of genetic suffering. The story of the Hadley family is a dark chapter in American history, one that serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of human ignorance, the destructive power of fear, and the tragic consequences of trying to preserve something that was never meant to be. The Hadley family's legacy, though fading with time, still looms large in the memories of those who know the truth. Some secrets are too dark to forget and too terrible to remember, and the story of the Hadley family is one of those secrets. It is a permanent reminder of what happens when love, twisted by fear and ignorance, becomes the most destructive force in human history. The Hadley family's tale is not just a story of genetic destruction, but a story of how the desire to preserve a family, to keep it intact, can lead to its absolute ruin.